Marc Stevens was just a child when he found his father's medals from World War II. It took years, long after his father's death, to discover his dad's secret life and wartime heroics. Marc was not a professional writer, but he had to share the story, which he did in his book, Escape, Evasion, and Revenge. Hi, I'm Craig Colby, owner of Colbyvision, a storytelling company, and I've been producing television of all sorts for 30 years. Live event, doc, lifestyle, crime, history, science, sports. I've done it all. I love it all, and I've learned something new from each. And this show is about storytellers talking about the methodology of storytelling. And if you want to learn more about the dark arts, this is where to go. And my first guest, Marc Stevens. He is the author of this crazy good book, Escape, Evasion, and Revenge. And welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Craig. Appreciate the invitation.
Very happy to talk to you about this. Now, before we get things started, you are not a professional writer by trade. What do you do?
I sell food ingredients. I have sold for the last 36 years or so. I've been selling wholesale food ingredients to food manufacturers all around the world. And
yet, you still have written this brilliant book. I guess that's not a surprise. People do have talents. So let's just start talking about this book. It starts with you finding out about a secret life that your dad had. How did you find out about this life?
Well, interestingly enough, I didn't realize that my father had led a secret life. I grew up knowing that my father had been a Royal Air Force pilot during the war, a bomber pilot. He'd been shot down and captured by the Germans and had spent several years as a POW and had made a few escape attempts and had finished the war with the Military Cross, which I didn't really realize the significance of that medal and the rarity of that medal for an Air Force officer. That was pretty much as I knew about him. And then, of course, he died when I was 22 years old, and that's what really sparked my interest.
So you knew all of that stuff before he died?
Correct.
Right. And then after he died, what inspired you to dig a little deeper?
Somebody brought to my attention a letter written to the editor that was published in the Toronto Star, probably 1987, 1988, something like that, that asked for stories from people who had been involved in the Great Escape. And I knew my father had been a prisoner of war in the camp where the Great Escape had taken place. And even though my father had not been directly involved in the Great Escape because he was in a different part of the camp, I knew he was a pretty, shall we say, keen escaper and had been involved in several escapes in his own right. So I took a chance and I wrote back to the author of that letter, just giving a few particulars about my dad, and we started exchanging letters.
And what did you find when you started getting letters from him?
That's when the story really started to unravel, and that's when I really started to take a serious interest, because what I learned or began to learn was that my father had been a serial escaper, very likely one of the most probably top 10 or top 20 escapers as a POW in World War II.
So what happened next? Where did you go next?
Well, I asked the original letter that I responded to had been written by a fairly young British author who was himself an expert on POW escapers. And he told me he knew all about my father. In fact, he probably knew more about my father than I did at that point.
And so where's the next place to dig?
Well, that's a good question, and that opens really the can of worms, because I ended up making several trips to England and started finding things that really blew my mind. Started off visiting the National Archives in London, visited the Bomber Command Association, which is part of the Royal Air Force Museum just outside of London. Got all kinds of tips and hints as to how to go about beginning my research from the wonderful folks over there, and started finding things that really made my jaw hit the floor. For example, the very first time I went to the National Archives in London, digging out old microfiches of my father's operational records. He was a bomber pilot, and he'd flown about 22 missions before he'd been shot down and captured by the Nazis. And on one of those missions, about a month before he was shot down, he and his crew had dropped bombs on a railroad target deep inside Germany, and were on their way home in the middle of the night. Of course, it was pitch black. Somewhere over Belgium, they think, and they were jumped by a German night fighter who strafed them from stem to stern. All three of my dad's crewmen were injured. The airplane was really badly shot up, and he was starting to lose control. And by hook or by crook, by sheer blind, dumb luck, one of his tail gunners, because there were two in that particular type of aircraft, while they were in a near vertical dive, reached up, grabbed the trigger of his gun, and just happened to hit the German night fighter in his fuel tanks, and he blew up into a million pieces. Luckily, my dad was then able to regain control of the airplane and barely get it back to England, and saved the lives of those three crewmen. As I said, all three of whom were injured. One with life-threatening injuries. He nearly bled to death from a cannon shell through his leg. And Dad was able to pull off a flawless belly landing back in England, because he had no landing gear, no flaps. Everything had been destroyed in the attack. And I was able to get into contact with two of the three men from that trip. One, unfortunately, had died just 6 months before I'd started my research. So I wasn't able to get in contact with him, but I did reach out to his children. And today we're Facebook friends, and we correspond on a regular basis. So all three of those people were of the opinion that my father had saved their lives. And when I saw that, that's what really floored me and spurred me on to go deeper into the story.
And where did you look to find deeper once you talked to the people that he served with? Well,
that's where I started. I started writing letters to those people, and I had no idea who they were. They were just last names in a logbook when I first started. So I had to go through the Royal Air Force Personnel Department and wrote letters addressed to these men in care of the RAF Personnel Department. They forwarded the letters, and in due course, I got letters back from two of the three men who were, super excited and pleased to hear from me. This would have been around 1988 or 89, probably, which is, almost 45 years after the war, and certainly 47 years after the events that we're talking about, which took place in 1941. So they were very happy to hear from me. They were sad to learn that my father had died in 1979, but they were more than happy to chat with me and exchange letters and talk on the phone. And then I eventually went over there and met with both of them.
So through your research, you're talking to the people he served with. You are researching with the British government. What did you find out about your father?
What I eventually found out, and it took me 18 years to discover this, because I eventually found a file that was marked secret and was sealed until the year 2051. This was in the National Archives in London. What I was able to ascertain from me getting early access to this file using the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to find out that, in fact, my father had not been British at all. He was actually born in Germany. And I'd known that when I was a kid. My parents had taken me aside at one point and told me this, but they'd also told me that it was a deep, dark family secret, and I was not allowed to divulge it to anyone on pain of death because it could ruin my father's career. So I knew my father had been born in Germany, and I knew that his widowed mother had sent him to safety in England, not safety, but just sent him to a safer place in England before the war. What I didn't realize is, and I discovered this in 1996, after 8 years of research, that my father was actually born Jewish.
Now, obviously, that has gigantic ramifications for this story. What was your reaction when you found that out?
Well, it took me a while to pick my jaw up off the floor, of course. That goes without saying. But interestingly enough, my older brother by that point had met and married a Jewish woman and had himself converted to the Jewish faith. So although we were both brought up as Catholics, along with our mother's faith, and that both of us had left the church independently of one another, this became very much ironic.
Clearly the calling was there.
Yes, it would seem that way.
And so you're just walk me through this next part of the story, because I think it's important for people to hear it. You find out that your dad is born Jewish. He's from a Jewish family in Germany. His family sends him to relative safety in England. What happened next?
Well, he completed his education, throughout the 30s. He learned English because when he first got to England in early 1934, I don't think he spoke much English at all, if any. So he continued his education, did 1 year at the London School of Economics, dropped out through lack of funding because, of course, the Nazis had basically confiscated most of the family's assets in Germany. They had originally been quite wealthy, but when the Nazis took over in 1933, they imposed all kinds of taxes and foreign exchange restrictions on Jewish people, so they were unable to get their money out of the country. And inevitably, by 1939, the Nazis took it all. So there was nothing left for my father to live on. My grandmother, who was left behind, she got her all three of her children out to safety in England by 1938-39. I found out subsequently she was left behind, and just before the war began, before the outbreak of the hostilities, about 6 weeks before that date, she took her own life, which was another big revelation for me, and a very sad one, obviously.
So that left your father in a difficult position in England without money. What did he do?
He did what a lot of people would have done. He resorted to crime.
And he didn't get very far with that, did he?
No, he didn't. He got caught very quickly. I mean, we're talking about petty crime here. Stealing the equivalent in today's dollars of $400 or $500, I think, from an employer. And he was caught and sentenced to, this was in summer of 1939. So the year war broke out. He was sentenced to a 3-month prison in a boys' prison because he was only 20 years old at the time. Mm-hmm. And the age of majority in England was 21. So luckily for him, he was sent to a boys' prison. Now, as you know, the Nazis invaded Poland on September 1st of 1939, which was the precipitating event for World War II. On September 3rd, 2 days later, Britain, having issued an ultimatum to Hitler to get out of Poland, and having received no reply to that ultimatum, declared war on Germany as part of their mutual defense pact with Poland. So my father was kicked out of jail early. He'd only served 6 weeks of his 3-month sentence. He was kicked out of jail, but it was also at the same time told to go. He was given a train ticket back to London and was told to, once he arrived in London, to report to a police station and they would know what to do with him.
And that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what he did, right?
That's exactly what he didn't do, because he knew that if he reported to a police station, they would just turn around and rearrest him and put him in jail for the entire duration of the war. And nobody at that point knew how long the war would last. So that was the furthest thing from his mind.
So what was the first thing on his mind?
The first thing on his mind, he being a 20-year-old young man with, shall we say, full pants, and I don't mean in the back end, I mean in the front end, he wanted to fight the Nazis, and he wanted to fight them pretty badly. Mm-hmm. So what he did when he got to London on September 1st or 2nd, having just been kicked out of prison, he went to a cemetery where was buried one of his schoolmates. During his time in London High School, one of his schoolmates had died. The entire school had been to the funeral, so he knew where this boy had been buried. He went and located the grave of this boy, wrote down the particulars of his birth and his name, of course, which he already knew, took that information to a government office, to a government registry office, and then requested a replacement birth certificate, claiming that he was himself the person who had died. He took that birth certificate, that false birth certificate, the very next day, September 3rd, when war was declared. He took it to the Royal Air Force enlisting station and plunked it down on the desk and said, "My name is Peter Stevens," even though his name was actually Georg Hein from Hanover, Germany. He told the Royal Air Force his name was Peter Stevens, and then he wanted to be a pilot.
And so he gets out of jail briefly. Instead of going for parole, he assumes an identity and enlists in the Air Force.
Correct.
And what did the police do when he doesn't show up for his parole?
Oh, that's a good question. They immediately initiated a manhunt because by that point, war had been declared. And here was this potentially dangerous enemy alien on the loose in England, possibly a Nazi spy, who knows. So they instituted a very serious manhunt. Now, it took them about 18 months, but they finally did track him down.
And they found where he was, and where was he then?
By that point, he'd flown his 22 combat missions as a bomber pilot, had been shot down and captured by the Nazis. Luckily for him, the British police didn't discover his change of name, his identity theft, if you will, until exactly 1 month after he had been shot down and captured.
Well, listen, this is an incredible chain of events. So, you know, the police are looking for him in England. He's flying bombing runs over Germany, where if he's shot down and they find out who he is, he's not a prisoner of war. He's a traitor.
Correct.
He will be shot. So he has to conceal his identity in Germany as well.
Yes. The consequences of discovery of his true identity by the Nazis would have been undoubtedly very unpleasantly fatal.
Yeah, I don't know a lot of pleasantly fatal, but there's, you know, I'm sure they would have made it worth their while. So I don't want to give away the book, which is this, by the way. And if you don't want to read it by now, I don't know who you are. And I have to say, like, Mark and I have been friends a long time. When I finally got a copy of this book, I started reading it right away and loved it. And my wife was so mad at me because she wanted to get to it first, and we didn't actually share it. I read it as quickly as I could. So you've got this incredible story. How do you decide to write it? How do you haven't been a writer. It's not something you've been trained for. How do you decide I'm going to write this book?
That was a difficult decision for me to come to, Craig. I knew that there was so much information here, and it was having been interested in POW stories much of my childhood and through my youth. I thought, you know, I'd read a lot of stories of good POW escapers, and with all of the information that I discovered about my dad's story, I thought, you know, this story is as good as and better than most. And if it doesn't get written, if it doesn't get publicized, it would be a real shame. And so, even though my father had been dead for almost 20 years at that point, when I made the discovery about his true ethnicity and his religion of his birth, I thought at that point, okay, now I have to write a book. And that was the late 90s. And in the early 2000s, I guess 2006, was when I finally made the discovery of the secret file at the National Archives in England, when I finally got that open in late 2006, early 2007, and made the discovery of his criminal past and the police manhunt that had been organized, and a couple of various tips they had received throughout the course of their 18-month investigation, trying to track him down. That's when I decided I really had to write the book.
And how did you go about writing it? Where do you start?
Well, that's a difficult one because, as you said, I'd never written a book before. I mean, every author has to start somewhere. Nobody's ever written a book when they're born. So I just rationalized it and said, okay, how would I map this out? And so I literally, in a plain Word document, just started mapping out individual chapters and just went chronologically at first and decided, starting from my father's birth until his death, went through and what made a logical progression and broke it up into 20 or 30 chapters. So then I had the map to go from, then I just started writing. And it was the scariest thing in my life, looking at a blank screen, turning on my computer every night after work or every other night after work, and just sitting down for hours and hours and hours and slogging through it until I reached the point where I had 100,000 words down on paper.
So you started, I mean, you had done almost all your research before you started, correct?
Correct.
And you started structuring.
Yeah.
Which is the way to do it. The way to defeat that empty blank staring screen is to already have the plan in place and then only have to put down the words. So when did you write?
Well, I first started writing the book during a period when I was between jobs. So I had about a 6-month gap between jobs in 2004, I think. And I did about 3 months of solid writing. And I can only write for about 2 or 3 hours a day. That's all my brain will allow. And after that, I go into overload and I feel fried and totally worn out. So I was doing maybe 1,500 words a day, something like that. Did it for 3 months solid, burnt myself out, found a new job, had other things happening in my life. My mother got sick and died. So I really just put the project aside and put it on hold for a while. Came back to it, I think in 2006, so 2 years later, or 2007, excuse me, after I just made the last discovery of that secret file that I'd gotten opened using the Freedom of Information Act, and decided, okay, now I have to finish the book. I have no excuses. And so it was eat, sleep, work, and write, basically. You know, I had a full-time job at that point, working for a good-sized food manufacturer. So I was working 9 to 5 kind of thing from my home, luckily. And then, you know, I'd take a break, watch an hour of TV, eat supper, and then go back to my desk at around 7:30 in the evening and write till about 10.
It's not unusual to write in bursts like that. There's a lot of people who, I mean, if you haven't written, what people may not understand is it takes a lot of concentration. Like the most beautiful times in writing are when you actually get into a zone and time disappears and you look up, it's 5 hours, but it's not always like that. Sometimes it's just pushing. So you've got years of writing at night, right? Mm-hmm. You finally have 100,000 pages. How often
100,000 words, yeah.
100,000 words. 100,000 pages would be a big ask. How often did you play with the structure?
Only once or twice, interestingly enough. I had a couple of moments, if you will, discovery moments where I literally sit bolt upright at 2 or 3 in the morning, woken up out of a deep sleep and say, I have to do this to change the structure or come up with a different idea of how to handle the situation. I was a little worried that if I kept everything in chronological order, it would be the first third of the book might seem a little boring because it's really his youth, his childhood, you know, the fact that he came from a very wealthy family in Germany and that they lost a lot of their wealth thanks to the Nazis. Everything leading up to him, I guess, 1938, 1939, where he goes to jail for the first time, that I thought might be a little on the boring side. So I changed the structure of the book to start it with the first chapter being his last combat mission where he gets shot down and one of his crewmen gets killed. And I thought that'd be a much more interesting opening. So
you started in action, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that right. When I talk to people about writing, I call that the James Bond opening. If you start with a nice big juicy hook of action, it's a really nice in for people. And then they have I wouldn't say the patience for the context, but they certainly are ready to have the background for it. So any writer will tell you a lot of writing is rewriting. You've got your full text. What did you do about rewriting?
That's an interesting question. I think if you're writing fiction, rewriting is a part of the process you have to do yourself. I was writing nonfiction. I wrote this book in the form, if you'll forgive me, in the form of a doctoral dissertation. It's 225 pages and 250 footnotes. And the reason I did that is because at some point I realized this story is so fantastic in the dictionary definition of the word. It's so unbelievable that somebody might at some point call bullshit. If I didn't include all of the research and all of the references that I'd come up with in the course of 18 years of research. So I decided to write it in a nonfiction form with all of the footnotes. And that way I was too close to the story to rewrite it myself. And I knew that going in. I had just totally worn out every brain cell that I had at the time when I finished. And so I decided to hire a professional editor to clean it up for me.
So you wrote it, handed it over, and gave it to someone, and they did the next part for you.
Yeah, I wrote a big fat check. It wasn't easy.
Well, it's one of the, I always say that when people have handed me shows to give them notes, it's like giving it to yourself 3 weeks later, because everything I've ever done, I've looked at and wanted to change something. But, I've been doing this my whole life, and I went to school and learned, English, writing for English. For somebody who hasn't, I think that's a really good decision to hand it over to somebody who is used to doing the pruning and combing work needed to get something into shape.
Right. I've been given a reference for somebody who had done a lot of editing of nonfiction books and had a serious interest in military history. So when I described the project to him, he was fascinated and couldn't wait to get his hands on it. And basically all he did was clean it up and tighten it up, and he shortened it. He took it down from 100,000 words to 85,000, which made it, I think, a lot more readable.
Yeah, Stephen King says that your second draft is your first draft minus like 20%. And a lot of rewriting is taking things out and tightening them. So now you've got, what did you notice different when you read the book?
I've never actually read it, interestingly enough.
You sold me a book you hadn't even read.
Yeah. Why should I read it?
I know getting it published is an entirely different thing. How did you go about getting the book published?
During the dry spots, during the periods when I wasn't writing, I was doing an awful lot of research as well about the publishing business, and talking to people that I had met in England who had written books and had them published, just trying to figure out what would be the best way to handle that aspect of the piece.
And so who did you eventually end up with as a publisher?
Well, interestingly, I started off with a recommendation to go to the very top. I had an introduction through a colleague, a Royal Air Force colleague of my father's, who had actually escaped through the same tunnel as my father had one night. His autobiography had just come out in England in 2000. When was it? Probably 2006, something like that. Just before I'd finished writing, and he gave me an introduction to his editor at Random House. And they seemed interested at first. But they took almost a year to give me any kind of feedback. So I was getting a little bit anxious after, 8-10 months and not hearing anything. Finally, I basically said, okay, now it's time to either do it or get off the pot. So do you want the book or don't you? And they said, well, it needs a rewrite. And I said, okay. Not being familiar with the process, I said, well, give me some guidance, give me some direction. How does it need a rewrite? What do I need to do to it? How do I change it? How do I fix it? How do I improve it? And they weren't willing to spend the time to do that. So at that point, I knew, okay, you're on your own. Now it's time to go somewhere else and shop it around. And I had already decided long before that my fallback position, my first fallback position, would be two specific military history publishers that I'd already investigated and identified in the UK. This being a story that took place in the UK, I thought I'd probably have an easier job finding a publisher over there. And sure enough, one of those two basically saw the manuscript and responded within a few weeks that they wanted to publish it right away.
So that's taken care of.
Yeah.
Now you've got a book out there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how
a year later, yeah.
You've written it,
yes,
which is a huge accomplishment, and you've gotten it published, which is another huge accomplishment.
Yep.
So
and I even got an advance for it.
That's fantastic. So you got paid. Like, that's the trifecta for writers.
Yeah.
You did it, you got it published, and you got paid by someone else.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic. What's next for this story?
Well, what was next at that point in time was the realization that this book is not going to get splashed all over the newspapers. Having said that, it did get splashed a bit in the UK in newspapers. I think that was probably a little bit of, or really the only marketing done by my publisher. And I realized very quickly on after that as an author, you are your own marketing director. So I did whatever I could think of, whatever spare time I had, which as a full-time employed person wasn't that much. So I would give speeches to whatever group was interested. I would sell books almost on a street corner. I'm exaggerating somewhat, but anytime a group of retired people had a meeting, and there were lots of clubs, service clubs, those kind of things, they were always looking for speakers. Genealogical societies all over Ontario looking for speakers, that kind of thing. So I did a lot of marketing that way. And then I decided, most of the people I knew, most of my friends, and even people I didn't know who would contact me over the internet who had read the book, said this would make an amazing movie. And I'd always thought that, but we all have grandiose plans.
Yeah.
And so I thought to myself at some point, well, okay, I guess the next step has to be to write a screenplay. And I was scared to death of writing a screenplay. But I took a course, an intensive weekend-long course of 20 hours or 24 hours over a weekend with some big names in the field, and it wasn't cheap. But I'm not afraid to spend money to learn. So did that, and then had a bit of writer's block. I didn't know where to start the screenplay. I didn't know where in the story to start it. And a mutual friend of ours, Larry, gave me a really good tip, I thought. And once I had that settled in my mind, I thought, okay, that makes sense. It's a great opening, or it has the potential to be a great opening. So I finally sat down and actually started writing. And that was about 3 years ago.
So you got to tell us what that opening is.
It's the first scene in the original first draft of the screenplay was my father being released from jail in the summer of 1930. Well, September 1st, 1939, the day the Nazis invade Poland.
Well, I really have to tell you, as much as we both love Larry, I think he stole that opening from the Blues Brothers.
Yeah, maybe.
Which is not a bad place to go. It's not a bad place to go. I got one more question for you. Well, I have two more questions. First, where can people get the book? Where can they get this?
The hardcover is long since sold out of its press run, unfortunately. But the paperback is readily available on Amazon or directly from the publisher, which is Pen and Sword Aviation in the UK. They have a very good website, and they publish hundreds of military history books every year.
But if you search for it on Google, you're going to find it.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do you feel about this experience as an author?
I'm unfortunate in that I'm like you, I don't have any kids. So the book is my fulfillment in life. Being able to get my father's story out there and told, and coming to the realization that he was a much bigger hero than I ever realized was even possible. As far as I was concerned, when I was growing up, as a cocky high school kid, he was the fat, bald, cranky guy who slept down the hall. And have come to realize through 18 years of research and 3 years of writing that my father was the biggest hero I've ever met in my life. And it's a shame I didn't know that while he was still alive.
Well, your father had an exceptionally amazing story. But I would also put it out there that, and I've been doing a bit of this lately, talking to people, there are a lot of amazing stories out there that people we have no idea about because we just don't take the time to ask and listen. So I think if there's one takeaway for anybody watching this, other than buy the book, it's sit down with your parent and ask them about their life.
And my father, I'll be the first to admit, my father was a genuine, writ large hero, but he was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a perfect human being. He was not a perfect man. He was a very imperfect man, but he was still a hero.
Who among us is? And, you know, who could blame your dad for the faults that he may have carried with him from the experiences he had throughout his life? You know, having to evade his entire life. That's not the best training ground for fatherhood, is it?
No, it isn't. And the fact that he went on to spend 5 years as a British spy after the war only adds to the mystique. What can I tell you?
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's not much of that in the book. Maybe there's a sequel in that if you can ever dig up any of that stories.
I tried. I actually wrote letters to MI6, and they came back. They immediately disavowed any knowledge of him until the point when I sent them a copy of their letter accepting his resignation from 1952. And then they came back, they went, oh yeah, we destroyed all of his records on what would have been his 65th birthday. Sorry.
You know, you've had an interesting life when people are disavowing knowledge of you. I'm not saying they don't know you really, but we just can't talk about it.
Exactly.
Well, Marc, I am very glad to know you. Thank you very much for talking to me. And thank you very much. I got to put it up one more time for creating this book, because it is a beautiful read and an amazing story. And I'm very proud to be your friend and really enjoy reading the book.
Thank you very much, Craig. Really appreciate your time.
All right. And that has been the first edition of Narrative Drive Time. Are you a storyteller who wants to tell the story of how you tell stories? Yes? Then I want to hear from you. Drop me a line at craig@colbyvision.net and tell me a little bit about yourself, your career, and some of the particulars of your process. Colbyvision is a storytelling company working in the broadcasting and the business world. Send me an email if you need help with either. Thanks to Tim Vesely for the music, and Kevin Francisco for the graphics, and Dave White for the editing. And thanks to you for watching Narrative Drive Time.